If we haven't had a chance to meet, my name is Mark Young, and I'm the president here. Come on up, guys. President here at Denver Seminary. I want to say thank you for spending the morning with us. And boy, what a rich morning. How would I say it? Provoked a lot of thinking at our table and in our conversations. We're going to take some time now and interact with your questions, as well as some questions that were submitted beforehand by those who were registered. And then if you have additional questions, submit them through the app, and they will appear up here on the screen that I'm monitoring. I thought it would be a good idea if we just begin our time by asking for the Lord's intervention in the Middle East. So if I may, let me pray for that as we come back together. Father, our hearts are burdened at the violence and the suffering. And we pray that through your Spirit, you would bring about peace, a lasting peace, a peace built on justice, and a peace experienced in mercy and compassion. We know that to pray these things sounds ludicrous to many, yet we believe you can bring it to pass. And so we cry out to you for a miraculous work. We pray the same for other places in the world that are in this very day tortured and beset by violence. Too many places even to name, too many people who suffer. And so, Lord, our heart's cry is, come quickly, restore what you created, bring about the life that you have desired that we have in your Son. And we pray it in his name. Amen. All right, let me get a question going. I want to introduce Dr. Ryan Tafilowski. I think we introduced you earlier or not? I can't remember. Whatever. Anyway, Dr. Ryan Tafilowski joined our faculty full-time this year and teaches in our area of systematic theology. He's a graduate of the seminary and also completed his doctoral work at St. Andrews?
Edinburgh.
Which one?
Edinburgh.
Edinburgh.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and I'm going to, by the way, use first names if that's okay,
Absolutely.
guys. Ryan did his work in the area, in an interesting area that relates specifically to our topic, his doctoral work. So Ryan, would you give us an overview of your doctoral work and how it relates to our topic?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. Glad to be with you. I am a Baptist by accident of birth, but I've been infatuated with Lutheranism all my life. And so my graduate work is all in Lutheran theology, and in particular, I looked at Lutherans in the 1920s and 30s in Germany and their responses to the rise of National Socialism, and specifically their attitudes on the so-called Jewish question. So I have been very interested in how Christianity responds to duress. So I've been very interested in the 20th century and how Christians respond to changing cultural norms in terms of their politics. So I'm interested in political theology and the dynamics of nationalism. So I don't specialize in American Christian nationalism or anything like this. I've learned a lot from our two keynote speakers today, and I'm not used to talking about people who are alive, so I'm very anxious. And I'm wearing a black sweater so you can't see how much I'm sweating. All right?
Could I ask you a follow-up question or two?
By all means.
You better say yes, I'm the president here. So,
Yeah.
As you look at the literature that embodied Lutheran thought, did the definitions of nationalism that we talked about this morning, would they be consistent with the way nationalism was understood, or the terms that related to nationalism in the authors, the pastors, those who were shaping opinion in that time?
Yeah, I would say a qualified yes, but mostly yes. Germans tended to think about nationalism in ethno-religious terms, probably ethno first. They have this distinct sense of Germanness that is inaccessible to any other people group. It is sacred in some respect. And so this is why they're so concerned with things like immigration, for example. So they're very worried that other people groups are going to change or compromise their Germanness. The theologians I looked at in particular see Christianity as essential to this sense of Germanness. In fact, the main theologian I looked at, who actually, Reverend Ritchie, quoted a guy named Paul Althaus, said that Germans connect with God in a way unlike any other ethnic group ever has. And if you've read the Bible, that'll strike you as a strange thing to say, right? But they've got this very profound sense that they are a Christian nation, almost like, if I can put it like this, ontologically, at the level of their being. It's transmitted ethnically. And so it's a little bit different than what we're seeing in the context, but I do think there's some parallels, yeah.
And would, sociologically and economically and politically, what were the conditions that Germany was experiencing that also led to and supported the rise of nationalism?
Yeah, okay. So there's some important parallels here. Thank you for the question. That's a good one. I would characterize German nationalism as an anxious response to pluralism, right? So what you're seeing are cultural changes that are happening very, very rapidly that are very unnerving. So lots of German Christians are feeling unmoored. So during the Weimar Republic, which was a short-lived democracy, it only made it 12 years. Most Germans never wanted it. They wanted the Reich. They wanted Bismarck back, right? And so they're very uncomfortable with pluralism, both politically and ethnically. There's also a sort of thriving gay scene in Germany in the 1920s. So there's lots of worry about sexual norms changing. One scholar described the Weimar Republic as a voluptuous panic, which is, I think, very striking language, a voluptuous panic. So they're worried about these things, and there's also economic considerations. So we complain about inflation now, and it's bad, but if you're a German in 1919, you need a wheelbarrow full of Reichsmarks to buy a loaf of bread, right? And actually, people are burning money in their homes instead of spending it. It's more valuable as fuel than it is as currency, right? So they've got cataclysmic inflation. And then there's this one other piece that's really relevant. There's a sense of aggrievement because Germans were forced to take responsibility for the First World War in the Versailles Treaty. They had to sign a war guilt clause that says that we take responsibility, we did this. And what's happening is many people feel like they have to be ashamed of their Germanness. That they have to be made to apologize for it. And this really stokes a politics of grievance. And I think that's one of our most important parallels to our cultural moment. I don't think they're exact, but I do think part of what's fueling Christian nationalism, and I'd be curious to know what you guys think, is that you've got folks who feel like they have to be apologetic about their Americanness. They're ashamed of it, or they're made to feel that they should be ashamed of it. And that they have to constantly apologize for things that their country has done that perhaps they feel no personal responsibility for.
Are you thinking specifically about racism and questions around systemic or structural or historical racism?
I think part of the reason that is such a provocative issue is because it offends our sense of justice in the sense that I didn't do any of this. Why should I be made to feel like I did it? And why should I be made to feel like I must keep apologizing for it, right? So I think, yeah, without question.
Let me ask you both as well. Are you seeing, or in terms of what Ryan has identified, do you see those as contributing factors to the rise of Christian nationalism in the U.S.?
I mean, I would say for sure at a pastoral level, just a personal anecdotal level, that there's an appeal that this is a safe group of people. The voices that we can listen to, the people that we can look to for direction in this moment aren't going to make us feel ashamed for being white, aren't going to make us feel guilty for something that we can't control. Like that is a part of the interior logic that makes it very, very viable. And so it's a real tricky thing, because history at its best is able to show us both the good and the bad of our story. And who does that really well is actually Israel and the Old Testament. I mean, yeah, like, this is our best guy, and this is the worst thing he did, you know, and there's an ability to be honest about that. Right now, we're in a moment where it's really hard to acknowledge hard things or bad things without it causing just endless shame. And so, and there is something that societally, I think, is at issue, because we are a society that's very quick to cast judgment and condemnation, but there's no mechanism for social forgiveness at a corporate level and repentance in that way.
No values of the kingdom, in other words.
Right.
Sam, how about you? Do you see in the data similar types of contextual issues as well as attitudes that Ryan identified?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're talking about things we're experiencing right now. I think is the perception that everybody is. I mean, the victim mentality. I think that is overwhelming. That is, and let me be clear. Like, some of that is. I don't want to deny that is legitimately experienced. A feeling of why is it always my fault, or people who are like me, or that kind of thing. Like, and a legitimate claim to, like, I personally didn't do this. I think that lacks an understanding of historical context. That lacks and one of the things I try to get across to my students is, like, say in my social problems class, or when I teach race and ethnicity classes, is to understand the ways, like, history has structured my own experience in ways that are different from my African-American sisters. I have 2 African-American sisters. My parents adopted when I was a child. So growing up in an interracial family, I think attuned me to the idea that, like, our experiences can be vastly different on the ways that we are, based on the ways that we are perceived, not the ways that we are raised, but on the ways that just strangers perceive us, and how that leads people to interact with us differently, and the ways that I benefit from that. And it always benefited. And I think there is a real perception that I think society has decided that that we will continue to oh gosh, maybe punish is the wrong word, but to continue to repeat this story of injustice, and without understanding that context. There can be an understanding that, like, hey, I feel like you're pointing at me in particular, and you're saying that this is my fault, or without realizing that, like, no, what they're really talking about is they're talking about unjust systems that you benefit from, and how we can rectify those things and how we can change that. But it's been spun in the sense that, like, hey, this is an attack on you. This is an attack on your values. They're trying to take something. This is some kind of a power move, so that they can have you under their subservience forever, and people who are minorities, or the left, or the immigrants, or those kinds of things. And so I think that kind of narrative is mobilizing and is being used to animate a lot of fear, anger, hostility, and resentment, particularly on the far right. Yeah.
I want to be clear that we make this absolutely clear. In no way are we associating white Christian nationalism with Nazi,
Right.
the Nazi Party, or the rise of Nazism. In no way. What we are doing is simply pointing out that there are some similarities in language and cultural belief values, as well as even sociological social conditions,
Right.
that between that time and this time. So, do I need to say it again? In no way.
And Mark, can I pick up on that? I think
Yes.
I also just want to reiterate, like, what we're describing, and something I mentioned in my talk earlier, is that there are certain contextual factors that inevitably give rise to certain reactions across a variety of contexts. So this isn't about, like, right now and Nazis, and that's the only time you've seen it. No, oftentimes we see when certain groups of people feel that they are victimized, that something is slipping away from them, that they are looking down a demographic future in which they feel like this is something that's not going to get better for us, and we have to make some compromises. We have to make some choices. Those choices often are the kinds of choices that say, like, how can we organize, get militant, leverage the power of story, leverage the power of identity to try to mobilize in response to this. And so I just want to say that, like, this is something that transcends these two different stories, and is something more fundamental to just human experience that we've seen.
That's a good point. Nationalism is not unique to
Right.
the United States and to
Right.
Germany. We see it all over the world. I want to make one other observation about the conversation we started about Germany. It is a fascinating exercise to compare how Germany has intentionally remembered its past.
Yes.
And compare that to how we have not intentionally remembered our past. That is a fascinating study of national psyche and identity and will. There are several articles available and writing on that I would encourage. All right, I want to shift gears a bit. David, I want to go back to something you brought up. Are there particular eschatologies or views of the future that seem to be more prominent in white Christian nationalist rhetoric and constituencies?
Yeah, so how would I answer that is in two ways. One is, I think oftentimes Christian nationalism actually casts its own eschatology. And so every single election is the most important election of our lifetime. We accord cosmic value to each of these contests, into which that is this universal battle between good and evil. And if our side wins, we either are kind of just kicking the ball down the field, or we might even be able to bring in the nation that we should bring in, right? It's the new heavens and the new earth. It's casting that. But if the other side wins, it really is just this apocalyptic destruction. It's a vision of absolute horror, and that's why at all costs, no matter whatever we have to do to get there, we have to be able to have this outcome, because it really is kind of like, it's been elevated to almost an issue of eschatological import. But with that, I think it goes both ways. I think certain eschatologies could be more prone to Christian nationalism, and I think Christian nationalism actually incentivizes certain eschatologies. And so I think that the prevalence of Christian nationalism is leading to more of a popular acceptance of two things it's the same idea, but coming at it from two different angles. One is, from the charismatic angle, it's more of dominionism. The seven mountain mandate, the whole idea of we need to take these centers of power, occupy the high ground, and be able to, from the top down, impose our will and our culture upon the rest of society. And that is a way that we bring God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. It's a mentality. And that's very similar to like a post-millennial theology of like, we're going to work together to be able to usher in God's kingdom through our agency, through our work. God working through us perhaps, but it's our work to be able to make that happen. At least among people that I personally know, that I've seen a shift in their theology. Like, there are people that were not post-millennialists 10 years ago that are post-millennials now. People that probably would have been a lot more just a kind of like a premillennial general eschatology, that are really leaning into a theology of dominionism that's actually at odds with that. And so whether or not it doesn't necessarily have to be internally coherent to be able to work, but it is something that's happening at a practical level, to where I think that the assumption is we are going to, as God's people, bring in God's kingdom on earth. And that it's something that very much Christian nationalism, it does something to the imagination that makes that more desirable and possible.
It seems to me we could look historically that it was premillennial apocalypticism that often led to dramatic evangelistic outreach, right? That famous quote about the boat and getting people in the boat. Everything has to happen before Jesus. And certainly Pentecostalism was very much in that stream of thinking, or in the early 20th century anyway, as was traditions that we've been a part of. But what you're talking about in terms of dominion is a dramatic shift toward what was decried by many evangelicals as the liberal option, right? Postmillennialism, late 19th century liberalism, early 20th century liberalism, which really begs the question, right? Are we more prone to shape our theology around what's politically expedient, or shape our politics around what our theological convictions are? You can answer that some other, yeah, I think you did, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say yes. And that's unfortunate, but it is something that we do.
Ryan, let me just ask this eschatology question of you. Was there an eschatological dimension or an eschatology that was present in what you studied in mid-20th century German thought?
They all would have been apocalyptically minded premillennialists, actually. So I looked at some conservative Lutherans who were reacting against liberal Protestantism, but they did have a tendency to sort of, as some forms of premillennialism can, infuse certain political events and figures with theological significance, right? So you did certainly see that tendency. Certainly Christians who were extremely supportive of Hitler see him as almost a messianic figure, and they really do believe that history will not reach its culmination, which, surprise, surprise, they believe Germans lead the way into God's future. But this won't happen unless God raises up such a figure. So there's not so much a sense that they're going to build God's kingdom, but that God is going to do something decisive in the German people that's going to usher in the kingdom, right? So there's a sort of German exceptionalism that's in a cocktail with some apocalyptic eschatology.
Fascinating. I really appreciate the fact that we've had conversations around the nature of the church and theology, but I also appreciate the sociological look at it. So Sam, I want to ask you this question. How have the data you've analyzed and observed through the years, how have those data changed your view of white Christian nationalism?
Yeah. So I think this is something I emphasized in my talk, and I'm glad this came up because I want to stress, like, we write these. I mean, I write mostly for an academic audience. I write like peer-reviewed papers, and we write books, and none of those books are supposed to be. And this is the way science works. None of those are supposed to be Bibles. They're not supposed to be timeless, definitive, true for all time. Like when we write a book, like when we did Taking America Back for God or something like that, we're basically saying this is what the best data that we could gather on this particular topic, and we've tried to analyze the data responsibly, and we've tried to keep our claims within the bounds of what the data will allow. And when the data, we get new data, and they cause us to say, oh, we didn't look at it this way earlier, and we need to really adjust. There's some things that we've adjusted in hindsight, and I'll give you a couple of examples. If you read Taking America Back for God, you'll find very little conversation about the very things I brought up in the talk about how these attitudes are often very contextualized by race, by racial identity. We mentioned this a little bit. We and I could point you to different places, but we don't make that an overarching thing. We don't call it white Christian nationalism. We just talk about it as this kind of like amorphous thing. In hindsight, after we collected more data, this thing popped out. We just said, wow, this is a really drastically different experience that people of color have from white Americans. That makes total sense when you think about like the legacies of this kind of theology and narrative. So we have had to adjust I think we have been accused of kind of like changing, why didn't you call it white Christian nationalism by then? Why do you call it that now? To kind of make it sound more scary. And it really isn't. I mean, like I want to resist that narrative just because that is not how it worked. It really worked as we gathered more data, analyzed the data, and said, like, we can come to no other conclusion other than this just works differently. Another example, and I think this is something where I was talking to Pastor Ritchie a little while ago. Some of my co-authors and I are diverging on different interpretations of what we see. One of my best friends, Andrew Whitehead, whom I wrote Taking America Back with, and we're still really good buddies, text every day. I think Andrew is still more of the opinion that a political theology, some kind of a coherent political theology is driving a lot of undergirding a lot of what we see here. I am becoming more persuaded that a lot of what is undergirding the theology is in fact an identity, is in fact like a threatened identity, a group level perception of who is like me, who is not like me, where is my status in relation to other groups in this country, how is that under attack, how is that under threat, and it is, like we're talking about with eschatology, it is motivating an adjustment of theologies to fit what is politically advantageous at the time. And things that I'm already inclined to. And I think identity is a more important part of the story. I think the data are leading me to suggest that identity that this Christian nationalism combines in a lot of fascinating ways with, say, like partisan identity. I'll give you an example. I was looking at data today, in fact, and this is just something one of the privileges of doing what I do, which is I've always got new data, and every day I get to sit in front of a computer, I get to play with data, I get to look at new things, and I get to learn new things. One of the things I was looking at this morning was I was looking at how perceptions of like which political party, which presidential candidates are pro-religion, are friendly toward religion. Pew asked this question recently. And I was looking at how Christian nationalism predicts whether or not you think Democrats or Republicans are friendly toward religion. The answer hinges completely on whether you're a Democrat or Republican. So if you are somebody who subscribes to Christian nationalism, like you know, kind of in a linear way, but you're a Democrat, surprise, surprise, you actually think the Democratic Party is more friendly to religion and you think the Republicans are worse. And the exact opposite flips. So what does that mean? Well, it means that a lot hinges, this kind of, what does it mean to be a Christian nation, Christian values? A lot hinges on whether or not that just represents your group, and whether you feel like your group benefits from that and how that works. And so I think that is how I think I'm adjusting my own interpretation in light of the data on these things, is so much of our theology, more than we're comfortable saying and admitting, is so much of our theology is rooted in interpretations that are founded on a sense of group identity, who is like me and who is not like me. And so I think those are examples of just how, within the past few years, just diving into the data has caused us to nuance our interpretation of this in different ways.
It has been really only in the last 40, 50 years that we've been far more attentive to how context affects theological understanding and biblical interpretation as well. Okay, let's go. I'm going to go to some questions that have been submitted. And interestingly, the first question, the one that has been affirmed the most, is one that each of you, well, the two of you who made presentations touched on. Ryan, I want you to dive in on this one as well. And it's very simple. What's the difference between Christian nationalism and Christian patriotism? So Ryan, could you start with that one?
I'm not taking questions at this time. Thank you for your encouragement.
That's fine.
No, I'm not sure how finely I can draw a distinction, although I think it's critical that we do. I guess I'll turn to Bonhoeffer here. I did all my research on people who are basically the opposite of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. That will put you in the ballpark. And then that got really dark. So after I finished, I've done a lot of work on Bonhoeffer in recent years. And Bonhoeffer, in his book on ethics, makes a distinction between things that are ultimate and things that are penultimate. And what he means is there are certain things that participate in the life of God or are grounded in creation. And then there are certain things that only exist as emergency measures because of the advent of sin into the world. And one of the things he says is the state is an emergency measure, right? Part of the problem that these theologians ran into is it's a very nerdy Lutheran doctrine called the Doctrine of the Orders of Creation, where they believe that God has instituted certain structures that guide creation towards its goal, and they are primordial in the sense they exist before sin. And they all want to put the state and increasingly racial identity in that category. And if you think that the state was instituted by God in creation, then you're going to accord a different kind of value to it than if you think that it exists because we live under sinful conditions. So what Bonhoeffer says is we need to learn to figure out which things go in the penultimate category and which go in the ultimate category. And part of me, I'm persuaded that a healthy Christian patriotism will find a way to talk about the state as valuable but penultimate, right? So it matters, the state matters, you should be politically engaged because it affects your neighbor, right? It matters for the common good, commonwealth, but you shouldn't assume that it has any permanent or eternal value, and you certainly should not throw the full weight of your trust onto it. It can't bear it. It's not designed to do that kind of work. So I think part of our difficulty is we're confusing penultimate and ultimate. And I know this is going to surprise you. I think the Bible helps here. I think both Paul and especially Peter give you a vision of this. In 1 Peter 2, Paul can say things like, fear God, meaning The word he uses there is a word that sort of suggests like a fear, a respect that grips you at the core of your being. He says, fear God, and then the very next sentence is honor the emperor. But the word he uses there suggests something like know your place before, right? So you fear God with the core of who you are, and you accord the state the respect to which it's due, but nothing more, right? So maybe something like recovering penultimate ultimate. Oh, thank you. That's why I do
They're
it.
clapping because a systematic theologian used the Bible. That's why they're clapping, Ryan. You actually quoted the Bible as a theologian. That's an insider seminary thing? Okay, so and let's make sure we're all on the same page. Distinction between ultimate and penultimate. What is that? Define that for us.
I guess maybe the simplest way I could put it is an ultimate reality is something that exists in God's future. A penultimate reality is something that we need under the conditions of sin, but which will pass away.
Good, thank you, very helpful. Sam, how would you ask the question or address the question of nationalism, patriotism?
You know, not as a sociologist, I put on my theologian hat here. So like, I think nationalism is reading the creation mandate given to Adam without any context. It is fill the earth and subdue it. Yes, that sounds appealing. Fill the earth and subdue it. There is some kind of like a mandate to conquer, to control, to rule. That is good. That is pre-fall. That is something that we ought to pursue. But when you actually look at it within the context of Genesis 2, what does that look like? It looks like a gardener. It looks like somebody who is taking the chaos of creation and ordering it and loving it and tending it and helping it to grow and flourishing it and leading it to, you know, in a self-sacrificial service kind of way and making something beautiful out of that. I feel like Christian patriotism in my mind is a contextualized understanding of what are we called to do as human beings. Like we're called to be, within the gospel, we're called to be good neighbors, we're called to be good stewards, right? Like it looks like stewardship, it looks like love, it looks like self-sacrifice. It does not look like us versus them boundaries. It looks like us for them, right? Like, and I feel like that's the big difference between patriotism. Patriotism should be, even if it's not Christian patriotism, but certainly Christian patriotism should look like love, should look like neighborliness and stewardship. Nationalism is motivated by fear. It's motivated by a perception that I have something valuable that other people want to take, or that other people have something valuable that I would like to take, and there's a zero-sum us versus them situation. I don't think that has to be patriotism. So I understand like people can, you know, draw blurry boundaries between those. But, you know, as soon as like the Russia-Ukraine kind of thing happened, I think was a good instance of like, people would look at Ukraine fighting and say, oh, that's nationalism. And I would say, actually, this is a good example to say like, nationalism is what is attacking a country. Patriotism is what leads you to defend your country from an invasion. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, David.
Absolutely. And I should preface this question by saying, unfortunately, I probably have to leave after I answer this question because Amarillo, Texas is very difficult to fly in and out of. And I'll have to be able to leave very soon, and so I'm sorry about that. I agree with every word that both Ryan and Sam just said. And something that I say in the book that's just so crucial to understand in relation to this question is that politics is a good thing. It's a necessary thing. It's an important thing, but it cannot be an ultimate thing because politics cannot save you. And when we put those messianic expectations on our political agenda, and then we kind of come behind it and say, okay, well, this must be God's will, or God must bless this, or God represents this, I think we are doing something bad to politics and something even worse to the name of God. And there's this image I think of in the Old Testament where Joshua has just crossed the Jordan River and he comes and he encounters the angel of the Lord. And he's got his sword drawn and it's just this big epic moment. He's like, okay, his first question is, are you on our side or are you on their side? And the angel of the Lord has the best response. He just says, no. And I think we need to hear the words of that no. That the Lord God who created the heavens and the earth, who is transcendent and holy and glorious, is not interested at all in being our political mascot. And patriotism can understand that. Nationalism can't.
That's super helpful. Thank you. And really good preaching. I mean, there are like several people are going to use that line. And
I
thank
do
you
have
for
to
being
agree.
with us.
So
Let's
thank you,
David.
guys. God bless you guys. Thank you.
Oh, very good to meet you. Hey, Travis.
Very nice. I want to take this question of patriotism a little bit further, and I want to bring it right down to brass tacks. Flags on the platform in church. So in the early 2000s, I did a lot of work in mainland China, and that ended with us hosting a delegation from the Religious Affairs Bureau, the state authority for religious affairs now, in our church in Dallas, Texas. And they wanted to come and see a church in the U.S., and so we took them into our auditorium, and on the stage, it wasn't a Sunday, was an American flag and a Christian flag. And of all the things we showed them in the building, what we did, the only thing they wanted to talk about was the presence of the American flag. Because in their mind, the purpose of the church is to support the state. And so if the church isn't engendering better citizens, more patriotic citizens, it isn't fulfilling its function in the eyes of the state. That gave me great pause.
Yeah.
So what are your views about patriotic symbols in worship spaces?
I'll say, so I don't want to hang him out too. I don't work at a seminary, so I can say this and not feel any consequences. So I personally am uncomfortable with that for the reasons that you brought up, and I'm almost honest with the same kind of scenario in mind. And unfortunately, I feel like, just speaking, so I'll just say I'm uncomfortable with it. I think it unfortunately gets framed as this binary, like either you have flags on the stage, or you hate the troops, or you hate America, or you're not proud of your country, or you're one of these people who just kind of is ashamed in that kind of way. I don't think it has to be an either or, right? Like just because you don't have flags on the stage doesn't mean you are not the kind of church that thanks God on the 4th of July. Say that prayer for thankful for the freedoms that we have, thankful for for whatever values reflect Christian priorities and protection for our religious freedom. Thank you for the troops. Thank you, on Memorial Day. That's okay. I think those are legitimate things. But I am also uncomfortable with the patriotic symbols, and I don't think that means you're being unpatriotic if you don't put them there all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, happy to speak to this. As it happens, this is controversy is probably too strong a word, but this is an issue we had to negotiate in the church where I pastor. So I teach here at Denver Seminary. I also pastor a small Baptist church a few minutes west of here. When I became the pastor, so a little bit of context, it's the church where I grew up. My father was the pastor there for 40 years before me, so I'm looking forward to handing it down to my son, family business. So I inherited this context. I did not ask for it, and of course, we all inherit our context, right? So there's no pastoring, there's no pastor theology that's done in a vacuum.
Right.
Okay, so I became the pastor of this church, and there's an American flag on the platform. For all the reasons we've described, and like Sam, I find it profoundly disturbing. I also find it inconsistent with our Baptist identity. You wouldn't have known this until the 1980s, but Baptists historically have been committed to the separation of church and state fiercely. And so as a Baptist theologian, I thought, why do we have this here? And so in a very un-Baptist-like move, ironically, I made an executive decision to move it. Now, this did not go over well, but it's not because my church is full of rabid Christian nationalist. The reason it did not go over well is because on a Sunday morning in my church, there are probably 30 plus vets. Many of them fought in Vietnam, a couple fought in Korea. I go to a Friday morning Bible study where I sit there with 5 Vietnam vets, a Korean vet, a guy who fought in World War II, he was at Pearl Harbor, and then me, who's never done anything difficult in my life. And so it's a very challenging dynamic. I've learned a great deal from them. And they came to me not in anger, but in sadness. Because many of these guys, particularly the guys who fought in Vietnam, said, we gave up a lot to do something that nobody really wanted us to do and we didn't ask to do. We got drafted to do it. We came back, we were utterly rejected by it, by the nation that sent us there. We're very, very wounded by it, and they don't want the flag there because we say the Pledge of Allegiance to it. They want the flag there because they want to be seen, is what it came down to. And so we had to negotiate this. So the Christian flag is back, but it is not on the American flag is back, it's not on the platform. And this is something we've had to grow through as a community. And now, on a Memorial Day, I gave a sermon in which I acknowledged all of our veterans and said, I'm sorry that we live in a world where we need soldiers. And we look toward a future where God is going to take every garment that's been rolled in blood and every warrior's boot, and he's going to throw it into the fire. This is penultimate. We're looking past this, but we still have to sort of name and value it while it's here. So that's how we solved it. I don't know that it's a perfect solution, but that's how we negotiated it.
I really appreciate your pastoral sensitivity and theological acumen in that. Question, if Christianity had a favored political status in the U.S., would that favor advance the cause of the gospel? Please don't talk over each other.
I'm happy to start here.
Go ahead.
Okay, here we go. There's this beautiful line from the philosopher Pascal, in which he says, "There's no one so miserable not to be king as a deposed king." What he means is everybody who's never been a king is fine not being a king. We've never known any different. But Pascal says once you've been king and you're not anymore, that's where the grievance comes in. It seems to me that American evangelicalism, we're experiencing something of the grievance of a deposed king. What's stirring all of this up is that we know what it's like to be on top, right? And we're sort of losing that. Now, what strikes me is when I read the New Testament, you've got these writers who are full of joy, never having been king, and suspecting never could have envisioned a world in which they would be, right? And yet it is there that we see the gospel at work with a vibrancy that we have not yet seen since. I am personally persuaded, although I'm open to debate about this, I'm personally persuaded that Christianity does best when it is not king. I'm willing to entertain arguments on the other side that surely it is better for our Commonwealth to have sort of legislation that reflects Christian values. I see that. And I think that's valid. But as a historical theologian, it seems to me that the church has been at its most vibrant when it's not on top. And I don't know. I mean, that may come in our generation. It's happening rapidly. But even if it does, people who hope in the gospel don't need to be fearful about this. Paul can write the epistle of joy from a Roman prison, right? And Peter can tell people that they've been born again to a living hope while Nero is on the throne. I think we can make it if a Republican or a Democrat is elected president.
Yeah, so sociologically in the history of the United States, if you trust the authors who were writing about this, like James Madison, they would argue that the church was at its most vibrant and effective when disestablishment was happening, right? So when Virginia no longer persecuted Baptists and they and funded Anglicans or maintained that everybody like be Anglican, James Madison would write in his writings that like, look, the clergy have never been sharper, the enthusiasm for the church has never been higher. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations has this wonderful kind of passage where he talks about like the difference between the established clergy who live off of government, tax stipends and have lost all of the arts of persuasion, and they're oftentimes supplanted by the Methodists who have learned this like to preach for their supper, basically. Like they have learned how to recruit, how to be creative, how to be aggressive, how to be innovative in the ways that they have like sought to communicate the gospel to others. And they are growing and they are like supplanting all of these very established fat cat kind of clergy who have become, indolent. So if you trust the people who are writing around this time the disestablishment is happening, the church was at its most vibrant in the United States and growing faster when it was not protected by the state, when it was not experiencing this kind of benefit. Now, I do want to acknowledge that I think there is if what somebody is talking about in terms of like flourishing of the gospel is really like not a person but a culture, right? And I think that's oftentimes what is happening. Like when they talk about like Christianity, they don't talk about Jesus or conversion to knowing Jesus and having a personal relationship with Jesus and following Jesus. What they're talking about is Anglo-Protestant culture. Yes, Anglo-Protestant culture probably flourishes a little bit better when the government enforces that and maintains that. Does that mean people are in love with Jesus? Does that mean people following Jesus? Does that mean people are actually going to the church and care at all? Not necessarily, and oftentimes probably not. And so I think, defining our terms, I don't think there's a really strong positive correlation between like the state privileging the church and them getting a real strong foothold in positions of power and the gospel benefiting as a result of that.
Excellent, thank you.
Yep.
Another question, how do you have a conversation with someone who is enmeshed in Christian nationalism and effectively make the case that it is antithetical to basic Christian concepts without severing relationship or without losing the opportunity for further conversation? In other words, how do you challenge someone in either a pastoral or a friendship, family relationship, and their view of the Christian faith because of Christian nationalism and still maintain relationships?
Right. Pastor.
A few things come to mind here. It's an enormously difficult challenge. I have people in my family where this has been difficult. People in my church context where it's been difficult. One concept that has helped me is from the theologian Rowan Williams, if you know that name, an Anglican theologian. He has said in one of his books that one of the marks of a mature Christian is the ability to keep on talking. Meaning, resist the temptation to just cut someone off. It's in his book on the rule of Saint Benedict. So it's about monks who commit to stability, to living in the same place with one another. And our churches ought to be that kind of place. Our families are that kind of place. How do you relate to someone where you can't just make them go away, right? It seems like we've probably all been tempted to think, if I can just make this person go away, well, that's not a gospel vision. It sounds obvious. Well, yeah, your seminary tuition dollars hard at work. It's not a Christian vision to tell people to go away. What he means, though, is Christians really do, if they're going to be gospel people, if they're going to be ministers of reconciliation, as Paul puts it, we got to cultivate the ability to keep hanging in there through really unpleasant conversations. So if we're going to have any chance of gaining traction in these conversations, it's got to come from a place that says, I'm not going away, and I'm not going to send you away. We're here. We're in this together. Now, I suspect that this could take an enormous amount of time and energy, emotional energy. But I'll tell you what does not work is dismissiveness. That, in my experience, this came through really well in Pastor Ritchie's presentation, I thought. It's very satisfying to sort of say, oh, I have these sophisticated views, and I'm just going to sort of dump them all over you and make you feel stupid. That doesn't help. As I'm fond of saying, around our congregation, we say that contempt is not a fruit of the Spirit, right? So, but long suffering is, right? So that's not a final answer, but I think it's got to start there. The commitment to just keep talking, hanging in.
Yeah, I agree. Very good. Do you have anything
Yes,
to add?
I was just saying, building those relationships. We talked with this group of pastors who are here this weekend just about the importance of cross pressures, like just maintaining relationships with people who are different and across a variety of different domains and spheres. I think it is killing us that people in the church, my church included in Norman, where I see people just kind of siloing into 5 different things that you 100% of the time can hang out with people who agree with you on every particular thing, including politics and not just theology and culture. I do think I in those kinds of conversations, I'm very curious to ask, and I don't want to be hostile, but I do want to get a sense of like how they view the lost. Like, do you see the lost as like are you here for them? Like, are you here on their behalf to serve, even sacrifice yourself for them? Or is the way you orient yourself towards them 100% in an us versus them? Mm-hmm. They are the enemies to be conquered. And the way you have to talk about love, because no one's going to say, I hate them. But if the way that you talk about love in that context is, well, I have to control them and it's for their own good, or I have to defeat them and it's for their own good. I really think, I think at that point you're kind of letting the political necessity do your theological reasoning for you. And so I try to help them kind of realize like what is a kind of Christ-like way to think through difference and holding these kinds of values in tension.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you for that, both of you. This question was clearly not asked by someone from Massachusetts. How do y'all think that Christian nationalism affects us in regards to situations happening around the world? So what's the relationship of Christian nationalism to foreign policy, essentially? And examples, the Russia-Ukraine war, as well as current war in Israel.
Sure, I'll answer that one. So we actually have data on this. We've published studies on this very thing. So what's going on in the United States with Christian nationalism, let's just call it white Christian nationalism for a second, is in some ways unique because we have this unique story of our own religious history and our own narrative and mythology about like what America has always been. And so we have our own identity related to that. But also what we're experiencing is what you might call an instantiation of what's going on around the world, which is like a resurgence in what you'd call kind of an authoritarian ethno-traditionalism. So like, let's talk about like it doesn't have to be Christian. It can be Hindutva. It can be Catholic, which is also, it can be Orthodox, which is definitely happening in other contexts. It's authoritarian because it's a very top-down and controlling and potentially violent kind of thing. But it has to do with this kind of like an ethnically aligned traditionalism that's kind of religious, but also just like traditional values. Let's go back to the earlier time where the right ethnoculture dominated, held political influence. What we see in the United States is just one example of a resurgence of what's taking place around the world. And so we are finding that people who, in the United States, affirm Christian nationalist views, they sense that in other political leaders, right? Like they're more inclined to feel like Putin exhibits the kind of leadership that you appreciate. That Viktor Orban is the kind of leader that we need in the United States, right? Like in his brand of like control the media, don't take any crap from anybody, kind of do what you want. This kind of appeal of strongman demagogues who don't apologize, who don't take anything from the left, who squash their opponents, is more appealing to that group. So I do think what we see in Christian nationalism in the United States causes a resonance and solidarity with authoritarian ethno-traditionalist movements around the country that we see in the data, and I think you can see on the news every night as well.
That point about authoritarian governments and the desire for your side now, not just to have influence, but to rule and punish those who are the opposite view. That seems to be amped up in the rhetoric that we're hearing in recent years, here and around the world.
Well, and this is something that I feel like is, I brought this up a little bit in the talk about like the anti-democratic impulses that I feel like are either latent or right on the surface of the things that I'm talking about. I'll relate it to this story. When I was a freshman in college, I was a chaplain for a baseball team at a local private Christian school. And this school had won multiple state championships. The coach was a very famous guy, but he wanted to have a chaplain. I was like a freshman in college, but I was enthusiastic and I was ready to like lead these guys in Bible study. So I wanted to come to their practice one day by surprise. And I came to practice one day and I drove up and I would just watch for a little while. Coach didn't know I was there, and I just saw him cussing out all of his players, like loudly shaming, ripping into all of them, and just, using really, really horrible language at this private Christian school. He turns around and he sees me, and he knows that I'm there. And so he walks up and talks to me after the practice, and he said, "Sam, I got two ways of talking to my players. The way Jesus wants me to talk to them, and the way they listen, or the one they listen to." And what he was saying is that because losing is not an option, and because that is such a high priority of mine, I have to go with the one that they will actually listen to, not the way that Jesus wants me to do, right? Like the ends justify the means, in other words, which he recognized were not Christian, and possibly really, really harmful. I think when we identify power and winning as the ultimate, when we elevate it to cosmic significance, and that, as Roger Stone said within the past year, and one of his Reawaken America tour kind of tours, he said, this is not about Democrats and Republicans. This is about angels and demons. And if we lose, we plunge the country into 1,000 years of darkness. Like this kind of rhetoric. If that is the stakes, then it justifies any kind of means to bring about that. And if you have to break a few eggs, then that's just what you got to get your hands dirty, right? Like it's got to happen. And I feel like that is an unchristian way to do it. It as you were saying, Ryan, I think it betrays a lack of faith in the gospel, in the way of Christ, that says, I got two ways of winning the country. The one Jesus wants me to use, and the one that works. And I'm going to go with the one that I think works.
Yeah, I would only add to that. It's exactly right. The culture war posture, I in some sense, I absolutely understand it. I understand what motivates it, and in some ways, I'm sympathetic with what motivates it. But what it concerns me about it is such a posture betrays that we don't actually believe in the truth, in the power, and the goodness of the gospel, right? Because if we did, we wouldn't have to compete on the world's terms, right? As this is Paul again, 2 Corinthians 10. He says, "We don't wage war like the world wages war." He doesn't deny that there's a war going on. Right. He just says that the weapons we use are not the same, right? And so we are armed with the armor of God, and with prayer, scripture, more scripture.
I think the question is, does nationalism naturally lead to isolationism?
Beg your pardon?
Does nationalism, Christian nationalism, ultimately lead to isolationism?
Right.
So the question is, how does Christian nationalism affect the way we view engagement with other nations and other conflicts, right? So, and definitely authority and power is one of the ways that affects. But is there a Christian, well, I'll just ask the question, does Christian nationalism lead to isolationism?
I don't know that I could say that it does in every case. I can say in Germany's case it did.
Yeah.
All of these theologians end up advocating a sort of Germany against the world mentality, almost without fail. And I hate to complicate your portrait of Bonhoeffer for you, but even early Bonhoeffer speaks like this. He says, God has given Germany a unique task in the world. And we are justified, he says, in trampling other people over other people's to accomplish it. He says this in 1928, right, in his Barcelona lectures. He changes his mind on that, but that shows you how deeply ingrained it is, right? That, and anytime we operate, because usually undergirding any nationalist vision is an exceptionalist vision, that my nation does something unique in the world and in God's plan that no other nation can do, and it is the most important. And if it is the most important, then not only do the ends justify the means, but also the only thing that really matters in the end is the destiny of my people.
Yes.
Right. So if other people are suffering, well, Paul Althaus said it's the destiny of Jews to suffer in the world. That's what he says, right? And so that's their lot in life. So tough. Yeah.
Good. Thank you all very much. We've come to reach the end of our time. You've solved all the problems, answered all the questions. And I want to say thank you to all of you for being engaged as you were throughout the day. This is not an easy topic, is it? This is not an easy topic because it's an incredibly important topic. If we, as the people of God, allow ourselves to be trapped in idolatry in any way, then where will people find Jesus? So from just the simple perspective that it's our desire that people come to faith in Christ here and abroad, protecting ourselves from any sort of idolatry is not penultimate, it's ultimate. So thank you for participating today in this, and thank you so much for your expertise. God bless.